Chain Drug Review and Mass Market Retailers Video Forum. Brought to you by the Emerson Group.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Wold, Editor-in-Chief of Chain Drug Review and Mass Market Retailers. Welcome to a special edition of our video forum. Our guest is Lynne Fruth, Chief Executive Officer of Fruth Pharmacy, who is here to tell us about her notable success in helping officials in West Virginia rein in PBM practices. Lynne, great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
You recently achieved a major victory in the battle with PBMs as it relates to the state's Public Employees Benefits Program. Tell our audience what was at issue.
So over the last 5 or 6 years, we have been meeting with the West Virginia State Governor's Office, senators, everyone who's involved, the Public Employees Insurance Agency, all of these different groups to say, we at Fruth believe that there's a lot of abuse going on in this program and that the state is likely being ripped off. Patients are being overcharged, the state's being overcharged, and there's a huge opportunity for savings, but they're relying really on the PBM that they have hired to be their broker, their handler of this, and they just tend to default to, well, the PBM says this and we believe it. It's kind of like that self-fulfilling prophecy that if you tell people enough times that you're saving them money, they actually believe it, whether it's true or not.
What were some of the PBM practices that you targeted, and how did those practices impact patients in West Virginia and taxpayers?
So the first thing that we identified, Jeff, was that as a pharmacy, we only see the reimbursement that comes to us. We see what we get paid. The patient sees what they pay, and the plan sponsor or the state sees what they get charged. But there's no transparency in all those areas for everyone to see what's happening, for you to be able to see where is this money really going. So the first thing that we identified many years ago was that we were, as a pharmacy, being paid significantly below cost on every brand transaction. It started out $60 as an average. Then it got worse. And then as the more expensive brands came in, we identified we're losing $100 every time we fill a brand drug under our cost of acquisition. Mm-hmm. So in this year, in 2023, it kind of came to a head because we did some analysis and realized we're losing $500,000 on this one insurance plan in West Virginia, which is the public employees. So we identified that, and we went to the state and so on, as we had for many years, and said, hey, this is not a fair reimbursement. But again, how do you prove what you know to be the case? So that's the premise. We've been working on it for 5 years. I actually 5 or 6 years ago said, when I turned 60, my goal before I retire is to help West Virginia fix PEIA. I'm a former teacher. I was on that insurance plan, and I believe we can do better for our state employees. I believe that people are being overcharged, the state's being overcharged, and my goal is to try to help bring a solution.
During the course of your work, you gained access to information that was key to the campaign. How did that happen, and what did the data demonstrate?
Every now and then, Jeff, I like to think every now and then something drops out of the sky for the good people. The good guys get something. But we actually had a patient come to us and say, I kind of stumbled onto something that is really very questionable, and I don't understand it, and I'd like to show you. So this patient had printed out a number of screenshots of different drugs, and in this case, the question was, my copay is the same at each one of these pharmacies, whether it's an independent pharmacy, Fruth, which is a regional chain, a grocery store, or a CVS or Walgreens, but I don't understand why if my copay is $160 at each of these places, it says here that if I get it filled at Fruth, which is my pharmacy, you're only going to get paid $300 more. But if I go to CVS, they're going to get paid $600 more. And so the patient is like, that doesn't seem right. Why would you be getting paid so much less? Mm-hmm. And we were like, that's a real good question. That's a question that we need to find the answer to. So because of that patient, I really would consider that patient to be a bit of a whistleblower, quite honestly. That patient provided us literally hundreds of screenshots from many, many different drug names, and a pattern started to emerge that was very disturbing. And there were three things that we identified. The first one was that what we discovered was in the majority of the drugs, which were very many that were looked at, Fruth Pharmacy as a regional chain was being reimbursed the least in almost every single situation. Then we found that the next group of reimbursements were West Virginia independent pharmacies. So they were all, for the most part, the West Virginia independent pharmacies and Fruth as a collective group were in the low end. And then there was about a midpoint of reimbursement, and Walmart fell there. And then we saw the higher reimbursements, with the highest reimbursements being CVS, Walgreens, Giant Eagle. And then there were a couple outliers, which we'll talk about later. But so then the question is like, that doesn't make sense. Why would a state plan allow their PBM to grossly underpay the state pharmacies, who, by the way, are the ones providing the care in a lot of your underserved areas, and yet these other pharmacies are being paid, in some instances, $1,000 more on a single prescription. In most cases, the highest paid pharmacy was being paid at least a 9.3% higher amount. But when you got into the most egregious prescriptions, in some cases, they were being paid 75% more. So I'm going to give you one specific example, which kind of you just say, whoa, this is a big problem. So there's a medication called clindamycin phosphate, and the patient's copay was $170. But in addition to that, the plan paid $1,300 and change to us, for a total of $1,471. The highest paid pharmacy was paid $2,412 for a total of $2,582, which was over $1,100 more on the same prescription, which was a 75.5% increase. And interestingly, that pharmacy was maybe 5 miles from our pharmacy. Mm-hmm. So you're not like, oh, well, this is some rural outlier, Eastern Panhandle. No, this is just the way the contract went. So when we saw this, we said, somebody needs to explain why the PBM is being allowed on a public plan that is funded by the state, that is taxpayer money, to opt to pay less than acquisition costs to the West Virginia pharmacies, and then turn around and pay huge amounts to other pharmacies.
As I understand it, that was just the beginning.
But then the second two areas that came in was kind of like when the whole world exploded. The second area was the patient brought in screenshots of what we would refer to as drugs that were not allowed to be filled at retail. So these, and the most egregious group of drugs was generic specialty drugs. So what we found was, and this is just a small list, but we ended up with about 25 drugs that were not, it's important to note, these drugs are not branded drugs. So there is no rebate associated with it. But these drugs are all in the system of PEIA as cannot be filled at retail. So what we found by looking at those was, because if that prescription ever came to Fruth or CVS or anybody at retail, your pharmacy system would send you a reject that simply says, this prescription may not be filled at retail. So the pharmacist, all they know is you can't fill this at retail. The pharmacist doesn't know what the patient's going to be charged someplace else and really can't advise them because they're in the blind. So there are all these drugs that the member might be charged as much as a $250 copay. And it depends on what type of, there's different levels of plans. But in essence, what you have is drugs. This drug, imatinib, is a leukemia drug. If we were to dispense that, and leukemia is nothing to mess with, we would be paid by Medicaid $147, which is a fair reimbursement. Under PEIA, the employee or the patient was paying up to a $250 copay, and PEIA was paying $5,200. So the overcharge is $5,000. So now I've said, in working with, Andy Becker, our lead pharmacy, our VP is amazing. And, he was really able to distill this down into a very understandable thing and was active in all the meetings. And so Andy is like, these patients are being charged these huge copays for these critical drugs. And that's just wrong because we could dispense it for a fraction of the cost. And then on top of it, the state is being charged $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, whatever. So the worst one that we found was temozolomide, which PEIA was paying almost $13,000 for. And when we dispense that under Kentucky Medicaid, we get reimbursed $900. So that's over a $10,000 overcharge. So in reading different things in the industry, I've read somewhere that maybe 2% of prescriptions make up as much as 50% of PBM profits. So it's like you take these little known drugs, maybe that are not that widely prescribed, you force them to your mail order, and then there's no transparency. There's no spread because you're actually telling the state, we're charging you $5,000 for this. But you're not telling the state, but that drug only costs $50. So now you really have three areas of significant abuse. The first one is that the pharmacies are being underpaid on purpose with full knowledge that you're putting them under cost, that you're putting them at risk of going out of business. Second thing, you're taking very vulnerable patients and you're charging them an excessive copay for a critical drug that they could get at a fraction of the cost. Third thing, you're turning around and then ripping the state off for millions of dollars.
Those are shocking numbers. Thanks for sharing them with us, Lynne. Please join us next week when we'll hear more about pharmacy's victory over PBMs in West Virginia.